English chroniclers of the 11th century describe a disturbing scene. Married women abandon their homes, their children, their entire lives, to follow strangers from the north. These men possess neither fabulous wealth nor noble titles. They offer only violence and uncertainty. So why do so many women choose them? The answer lies in a detail that history has long minimized. A detail so simple it seems trivial, yet so revolutionary for its time that it overturns the established social order. Before we dive deeper into this exploration of Viking civilization's most intimate secrets, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Whether you're listening from your living room, during your commute, or on a nighttime walk, your support helps fund these deep dives into the most fascinating historical archives. What we'll uncover together will challenge everything you think you know about these northern warriors. Behind their reputation as bloodthirsty barbarians lies a truth far more complex and sometimes profoundly disgusting. The Vikings weren't the filthy savages depicted in our movies and television shows. Reality was infinitely more nuanced, more troubling, and in certain aspects, more revolting than anything Hollywood has ever dared to portray. We'll explore their mourning rituals that disgusted Arab travelers, their extreme body modifications, their living conditions that fostered the proliferation of monstrous parasites, and how their genetic adaptations continue to kill their descendants today. But let's begin by understanding why women across medieval Europe literally fell under their spell. The year 1002 marks one of the bloodiest episodes in English history. King Tillard orders the massacre of all Danes present on English territory. Men, women, children, none are spared. Chronicles speak of systematic carnage, of unheard of violence. But what drives a king to order such genocide? The answer lies in the writings of John of Wallingford, a 13th century English chronicler, who records the true reasons behind this murderous fury. The Danes made themselves too acceptable to English women by their elegant manners and their care of their person. They combed their hair every day, bathed every Saturday, and even changed their garments often, every Saturday. Reflect on that for a moment. At a time when most Europeans considered bathing dangerous to health, when people believed hot water opened pores to disease, Vikings regularly immersed themselves in hot water. They called this day lagerdagar, literally washing day, while their English counterparts might bathe once a month if fortune smiled upon them. Vikings dedicated an entire day each week to cleansing themselves. But this wasn't merely about removing dirt and sweat. Archaeological excavations have revealed the sophistication of Viking grooming practices. Every self-respecting Norse warrior carried what we might recognize today as a personal grooming kit. Combs carved from deer antler, tweezers fashioned from bronze, ear spoons for removing wax, nail cleaners, even small mirrors made of polished metal. These weren't crude implements hastily crafted for basic hygiene. Many were works of art, decorated with intricate patterns, housed in specially designed leather cases. Wealthy Vikings wore their grooming tools as jewelry, hanging them from elaborate chains attached to their brooches, status symbols that announced to the world, "I care about my appearance." The English couldn't compete. John of Wallingford's chronicle continues with barely concealed resentment in this manner. They laid siege to the virtue of married women and persuaded the daughters, even of nobles, to be their concubines. Picture the scene. English men wearing the same woolen tunic for weeks or months, their hair matted with grease and debris, their beards harboring remnants of countless meals, standing beside Vikings who smelled of soap and herbs, whose hair caught the light, whose clothes were clean and often dyed in brilliant colors. The contrast was so stark that it created what we might call the first recorded instance of hygiene-based social disruption in European history. But the Vikings' obsession with cleanliness went far beyond weekly baths. Their hair received daily attention, not just combing, but elaborate styling. Viking men sported what we might recognize today as a reverse mullet, long on top and in front, shaved short at the back and sides. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate fashion statement that required constant maintenance. They used a mixture of lye soap, strong enough to lighten their hair several shades, to achieve the blonde look considered ideal in Norse society. Brown-haired Vikings would regularly subject their scalps to this caustic mixture, enduring burning sensations for the sake of beauty standards. Women, too, participated in elaborate hair rituals. Archaeological evidence from burials reveals intricate braiding patterns, hair ornaments of silver and gold, even hair extensions made from horsehair for those seeking extra length or volume. The Oseberg Tapestry, one of our most detailed visual records of Viking-era life, shows women with hair arranged in complex knots and braids, decorated with ribbons and beads. These styles required hours of preparation and the assistance of servants or family members. Ibn Rusta, a Persian geographer who encountered Vikings in the 10th century, wrote admiringly of their cleanliness. "They are the cleanest of people." This from a man accustomed to Islamic hygiene practices, which were among the most advanced in the world at that time. The Vikings had turned personal grooming into an art form, a competitive display of wealth and status. Their soap was scented with herbs and flowers. Their clothes were washed regularly in streams and rivers, dried in the sun, and stored with aromatic plants to maintain freshness. They owned multiple sets of clothing, an unimaginable luxury for most medieval Europeans. Undergarments made of linen, changed frequently. Outer garments of wool, often dyed in expensive colors like deep red or brilliant blue, indicators of prosperity and trade connections. But this obsession with external cleanliness masked some truly revolting habits that would shock even these hygiene-conscious warriors. As we delve deeper into Viking life, we encounter practices so disturbing that they challenged the understanding of even the most worldly travelers of their time. Ahmad ibn Fadlan was no stranger to different cultures. As a diplomat for the Caliph of Baghdad, he had traveled throughout the known world, encountered dozens of different peoples, witnessed customs both beautiful and bizarre. But nothing prepared him for what he observed among the Rus Vikings along the Volga River. His account, written in 922, provides one of our most detailed and disturbing glimpses into daily Viking life. What he witnessed in their morning routine would haunt his writings and challenge our understanding of Viking hygiene forever. Every day, early in the morning, one of the slave girls brings in a large dish of water and gives it to her master, who washes his hands, face, and hair in it. Then he combs his hair over the dish with a comb, blows his nose, and spits in it. Pause here. We're not talking about individual basins. This wasn't a private moment of personal cleansing. What Ibn Fadlan witnessed was a communal ritual that would make modern germaphobes faint. When the first has finished, the slave girl carries it to the next, who does the same, after which she carries it from one to another until it has been all the way round. Every one of them blows his nose and spits in it and washes his face and hair in it. Picture this scene in your mind. A wooden bowl filled with water at dawn. The first man washes his face, runs his fingers through his hair, then deliberately spits and blows his nose into the same water he just cleansed himself with. The bowl moves to the next man, who dips his hands into this cocktail of saliva and mucus, washes his own face, adds his own bodily fluids to the mixture. By the time the bowl completes its circuit through an entire longhouse, perhaps 20 or 30 men, the water has become a thick soup of spit, snot, hair, skin cells, and whatever parasites or bacteria each man carried. Ibn Fadlan, coming from a culture that practiced ritual washing 5 times daily with fresh running water, was horrified. He wrote, "They are the filthiest of all Allah's creatures. They do not purify themselves after excreting or urinating, or wash themselves when in a state of ritual impurity after coitus, and do not even wash their hands after food." But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. Ibn Fadlan was wrong about one crucial detail. The Vikings weren't dirty because they didn't care about cleanliness. They were obsessively clean by the standards of their time. This communal bowl ritual served a purpose he completely missed. Modern anthropologists believe this shared washing ceremony was actually a bonding ritual. In a culture where trust meant survival, where men depended on each other in battle and on long sea voyages, sharing bodily fluids created a sense of brotherhood. It was deliberate, symbolic, almost sacred. The same saliva that repulsed Ibn Fadlan was, to the Vikings, a guarantee of loyalty. Men who shared spit and snot couldn't easily betray each other. The ritual created an intimate bond stronger than any oath, but the health consequences were catastrophic. Disease spread through Viking communities with terrifying speed. A single infected individual could contaminate dozens of others within hours. Respiratory infections, skin diseases, parasitic infestations, all passed freely from man to man through that morning bowl. Archaeological analysis of Viking settlement sites reveals evidence of endemic disease. Skeletal remains show signs of nutritional deficiency, chronic infections, dental problems, and parasitic damage. The very ritual that bonded them together was slowly killing them. Ibn Fadlan's account continues with more disturbing observations about Viking bathroom habits. They neither wipe nor wash after defecation, he noted with disgust. This wasn't mere barbarism. Vikings believed that certain natural functions were so connected to the earth and the gods that excessive cleansing afterward would be disrespectful. Their concept of ritual purity differed fundamentally from Islamic or Christian traditions. Where Ibn Fadlan saw filth, Vikings saw spiritual connection. Where he demanded separation between clean and unclean, they embraced the full spectrum of bodily existence. Yet even Ibn Fadlan had to admit their physical beauty. "I have never seen more perfect physical specimens," he wrote. "They are tall as date palms, fair and ruddy. Their faces were clean, their hair lustrous, their bodies strong and well proportioned." The contrast between their careful attention to appearance and their revolting communal hygiene practices baffled him completely. The truth is that Viking cleanliness was selective, ritualized, and deeply cultural. They would spend hours perfecting their hair and beard grooming, then share a spit-filled bowl without hesitation. They would wash their clothes regularly, but wipe themselves with the same cloth for weeks. This wasn't ignorance. It was a completely different understanding of what cleanliness meant. But their most extreme body modification practices would shock even cultures accustomed to ritual scarification and tattooing. The skull was discovered in 1936, perfectly preserved in a Danish bog. At first glance, it appeared human, but strangely elongated, as if someone had grasped the head while still forming and stretched it like clay. When archaeologists realized what they were looking at, it changed our understanding of Viking beauty standards forever. This wasn't a natural deformity. It was deliberate, painful, and begun in infancy. 3 such skulls have been found in Viking-age Scotland, all belonging to women, all showing signs of artificial cranial modification. DNA analysis revealed these women came from the Baltic countries, possibly Lithuania, suggesting they were either slaves or immigrants who brought their own cultural practices to Scandinavia. But the Vikings didn't simply tolerate these modifications, they embraced them. These women were buried with typical Viking grave goods, jewelry, textiles, personal items, indicating full integration into Norse society. Their artificially elongated skulls weren't seen as deformities, but as exotic beauty markers, signs of foreign sophistication. The process was excruciating. Beginning in infancy, wooden boards were bound tightly around the skull, gradually reshaping the growing bone over months or years. The pressure caused constant headaches, potential brain damage, and required continuous adjustment as the child grew. Many didn't survive the procedure, but skull modification was relatively rare compared to the Vikings. Most widespread and disturbing body modification, tooth filing. Archaeological excavations have uncovered over 130 male Viking skeletons with deliberately filed teeth, not randomly damaged teeth from fighting or tool use, but carefully crafted horizontal grooves carved into the enamel with iron files. The grooves were then painted with red resin made from tree sap, creating blood-colored lines across their smiles. The process was agonizing. Without anesthesia or proper tools, Vikings would endure hours of scraping and filing, the sound of metal against enamel echoing through their skulls. The filed surfaces became infected regularly. Many teeth cracked or broke completely, leading to abscesses and potentially fatal infections. Why endure such torture for cosmetic modification? Several theories attempt to explain this extreme practice. Early researchers suggested it marked a warrior elite, men so committed to appearing fearsome that they would mutilate their own teeth. The red-stained grooves certainly created an intimidating effect when they smiled or snarled in battle. But more recent evidence points to a different explanation: trade guilds. Most filed teeth have been discovered near major Viking trading centers, particularly on the island of Gotland, a crucial hub for Baltic commerce. The men buried with filed teeth also possessed typical merchant goods: belt fittings, knives, scales for weighing silver, brooches indicating wealth and status. The tooth filing may have served as an identification mark for members of exclusive trading companies, like a permanent business card carved into their skulls. These modifications announced membership in elite merchant groups that controlled lucrative trade routes across Europe and into Asia. But the Vikings' most toxic beauty practice involved their eyes. Multiple historical sources describe Vikings wearing dark eye makeup, particularly around trading centers like Hidabi. Spanish Arab visitors noted how both men and women lined their eyes with a black substance that made them appear more youthful and attractive. This wasn't simple charcoal or ash. Chemical analysis of similar substances from the period reveals a cocktail of crushed antimony, burnt almonds, lead, oxidized copper, ochre, malachite, and chrysocolla. The Vikings were essentially painting their eyes with poison. Lead poisoning from coal use caused neurological damage, kidney failure, and premature death. Antimony created skin irritation and permanent scarring. Copper compounds burned the delicate tissues around the eyes, sometimes causing blindness. Yet Vikings considered these toxic eye cosmetics essential for proper grooming. They believed the dark lines enhanced their natural eye color, made them appear more mysterious and alluring, and provided spiritual protection against evil spirits. Archaeological evidence suggests they had access to less toxic alternatives. Charcoal was readily available and would have created similar visual effects without the poisoning. But Vikings specifically sought out the most dangerous substances, perhaps believing that beauty required suffering, that true enhancement came only through risk and pain. Their hair bleaching practices were equally extreme. Brown-haired Vikings regularly subjected their scalps to lye-based soaps with the approximate strength of modern drain cleaners. The caustic mixture burned through skin, created permanent scalp scarring, and often resulted in significant hair loss. Yet they continued the practice throughout their lives, enduring chemical burns for the sake of achieving the blonde ideal. Women used similar techniques but added additional elements. They bleached not only their hair but their eyebrows and even body hair, creating an almost albino appearance that was considered the height of Viking beauty. The process took hours and required multiple applications, each one more damaging than the last. Some Vikings took a different approach to hair modification. Rather than bleaching, they used oils and dyes to create elaborate color patterns. Archaeological textile analysis reveals hair treated with vegetable dyes in green, blue, and deep red shades. Wealthy Vikings might dye different sections of their hair in contrasting colors, creating striped or spotted effects that announced their prosperity and artistic sensibilities. But perhaps most disturbing was their approach to body tattooing. Ibn Fadlan described Vikings as covered in tattoos, from the tips of their toes to their neck. These weren't simple designs, but complex patterns that covered virtually every inch of exposed skin. Dark green pigments created intricate geometric shapes, animal figures, and runic inscriptions across their bodies. The tattooing process used primitive bone needles and pigments made from soot, plant dyes, and crushed minerals. Without proper sterilization techniques, infections were common. Many Vikings died from blood poisoning contracted during extensive tattooing sessions. The pain was considered part of the spiritual significance. Vikings believed that enduring the agony of tattooing demonstrated worthiness to the gods, that marked skin provided protection in battle and passage to Valhalla after death. But the most shocking aspect of Viking body modification wasn't what they did to themselves. It was how these practices created living conditions so revolting that they bred diseases unknown to the modern world. Winter in Scandinavia was a test of survival that lasted 6 months or more. Temperatures plunged below freezing for weeks at a time. Food became scarce. The sea froze, cutting off trade and fishing. Death stalked every household. The Viking solution was practical but revolting. They moved their livestock into their homes. Picture a typical Viking longhouse in January, 50 to 60 feet long, perhaps 20 feet wide, with thick walls of timber and sod. A fire burns in the central hearth, providing the only warmth and light. Smoke fills the air, seeping through every crack, creating a permanent haze that burns the eyes and lungs. But the humans weren't alone in this smoky chamber. Cattle, horses, goats, pigs, sheep, and chickens all sheltered in the same space. The western end of the longhouse typically housed the animals, separated from human living areas by nothing more than wooden partitions or hanging cloths, sometimes not even that. Archaeological excavations at Viking settlements reveal the shocking extent of this cohabitation. Floor layers contain mixed deposits of human and animal waste, food scraps, shed fur and hair, decomposing organic matter, and the remains of parasites that thrived in these conditions. The smell must have been overwhelming. Dozens of animals producing waste, urine soaking into earthen floors, decomposing bedding materials, rotting food scraps, and the accumulated odors of unwashed humans living in closed quarters for months. Vikings became so accustomed to these conditions that they lost sensitivity to the stench completely. But the olfactory assault was nothing compared to the health consequences. Living in such close proximity to livestock created the perfect breeding ground for zoonotic diseases, infections that jump from animals to humans. Tuberculosis, brucellosis, anthrax, and dozens of parasitic infestations spread freely between species in the cramped longhouses. Modern DNA analysis of Viking-era fecal samples reveals the true horror of their parasitic burden. Every single sample tested positive for multiple species of intestinal worms. Not some Vikings, not most Vikings, every single one was infected with parasites. The most common was Ascaris lumbricoides, the giant roundworm. These parasites could grow to lengths of 12 inches or more, living in the small intestine and feeding on partially digested food. A single human host might harbor dozens of these creatures, writhing masses of worms that blocked digestion and caused constant abdominal pain. Trichuris trichiora, the whipworm, burrowed into the intestinal wall itself. Only 2 inches long, but incredibly destructive, these parasites caused chronic bleeding, anemia, and malnutrition. Children were particularly vulnerable, often dying from the combination of blood loss and starvation. Liver flukes, contracted from sheep and cattle, migrated through the bloodstream to the liver and bile ducts. There they fed on liver tissue, caused massive organ damage, and laid thousands of eggs that would be expelled in human waste, ready to infect the next victim who encountered contaminated water or food. But perhaps most disturbing were the parasites that lived outside the body. Fleas, lice, and ticks thrived in the warm, humid environment of the longhouses. Human and animal hosts provided constant feeding opportunities. These ectoparasites served as vectors for even more dangerous diseases: plague, typhus, relapsing fever, and other bacterial infections. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Vikings were so heavily infested with lice that their scalps were permanently scarred from constant scratching. Clothing excavated from grave sites contains the preserved remains of thousands of lice eggs, indicating infestations so severe that even death didn't eliminate them immediately. The Vikings developed various strategies to manage their parasitic burden, but these often created new problems. They used mercury-based compounds to treat skin parasites, causing heavy metal poisoning. They consumed raw garlic and bitter herbs to purge intestinal worms. But these remedies were largely ineffective against established infestations. Some Vikings deliberately infected themselves with certain parasites, believing this provided immunity against other diseases. Archaeological evidence suggests intentional consumption of tapeworm eggs, perhaps thinking that controlled infection with one parasite would prevent infection by others. The reality was that their bodies became battlegrounds for competing parasitic species. Different worms fought for territory within the same host, causing internal damage that weakened the immune system and made Vikings vulnerable to secondary infections. Living conditions in the longhouses grew progressively worse throughout the winter months. Fresh air circulation was minimal. Opening doors or windows meant losing precious heat. Waste accumulated faster than it could be removed. Food stores became contaminated. Water sources froze, forcing Vikings to melt snow that had been contaminated by animal waste. By spring, many longhouses resembled disease incubators more than human dwellings. Families who entered the winter healthy emerged riddled with infections, malnourished from parasitic damage, and carrying diseases that would spread throughout their communities during the active season. The psychological toll was immense. Constant physical discomfort from parasitic infections, chronic pain from intestinal damage, persistent itching from external parasites, and the stress of living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions created a population on the edge of breakdown. Yet Vikings had no choice. The alternative, allowing livestock to die in winter storms, meant starvation and economic collapse. The animals were their wealth, their food security, their means of survival. Protecting them required sharing living space, no matter how revolting the consequences. This cohabitation had one particularly devastating long-term effect that continues to kill their descendants today. Modern genetic studies reveal that the constant parasitic infections forced Viking populations to develop mutations in their immune systems. These mutations were life-saving adaptations 1,000 years ago, but they've become deadly genetic time bombs in the modern world. The latrine discovered near Viborg, Denmark, is a time capsule of revulsion, used continuously from 1018 to 1030. This Viking-era toilet preserved 12 years of human waste in perfect anaerobic conditions. When archaeologists began analyzing its contents in 2014, they uncovered secrets so disturbing they challenged everything we thought we knew about medieval hygiene. The toilet itself was primitive, essentially a deep pit covered with wooden planks and surrounded by a simple shelter. Multiple users shared the same hole, adding their waste to an accumulating mass that eventually rose to within feet of the surface. No running water, no cleaning systems, no waste removal, just layer upon layer of excrement building up over years. But this primitive system inadvertently created perfect preservation conditions. Without oxygen, the waste didn't fully decompose. Instead, it mummified, preserving parasites, bacteria, and organic matter that would normally disappear within months. DNA extraction from 1,000-year-old fecal matter revealed the shocking extent of Viking parasitic infections. Every sample tested positive for multiple species of intestinal worms. The parasite load was so heavy that some samples contained more worm eggs than human cellular material. Ascorus lumbricoides eggs were found in concentrations that suggest each Viking harbored dozens or hundreds of adult roundworms. These parasites can live for years in the human intestine, growing to lengths of 14 inches or more. A heavily infected person would have been passing writhing masses of worms with every bowel movement. Trichura, the human whipworm, appeared in similar concentrations. These parasites embed their anterior ends deep into the intestinal wall, feeding on blood and tissue fluids. Heavy infections cause chronic dysentery, rectal prolapse, and severe anemia. The Vikings using this latrine would have been constantly bleeding internally, but most disturbing were the liver fluke eggs from Facilla hepatica. These parasites typically infect sheep and cattle, but they were found in human waste, proving that Vikings were consuming raw or undercooked liver from infected animals. The flukes would have migrated through their bloodstream to their own livers, where they fed on bile and liver tissue while laying thousands of eggs. The archaeological team also identified eggs from fish parasites, suggesting Vikings regularly consumed raw or poorly cooked fish infected with tapeworms and other helminths. Some of these parasites could grow to lengths of 30 feet or more within the human intestine, causing massive nutritional deficiencies and digestive blockages. Bacterial analysis revealed the presence of pathogens that cause dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. The lack of proper waste disposal meant that human excrement regularly contaminated drinking water supplies. Wells dug near settlements showed clear evidence of fecal contamination. The Vikings' toilet paper was moss, leaves, or fabric scraps that were reused multiple times. These materials became vehicles for spreading parasites and bacteria from person to person. Archaeological evidence suggests that some families shared the same cleaning materials for weeks or months, creating perfect conditions for disease transmission. Personal hygiene after defecation was minimal or non-existent. Ibn Fadlan's observation that Vikings neither wipe nor wash after defecation appears to be largely accurate. Though this wasn't necessarily due to ignorance, Viking culture viewed excessive cleaning after natural bodily functions as spiritually problematic. They believed it showed disrespect for the natural order. The location of latrines created additional health hazards. Many were positioned dangerously close to longhouses, food storage areas, and water sources. Runoff from waste pits contaminated soil, groundwater, and nearby streams. During heavy rains, raw sewage would overflow and flood into living spaces. Some Viking settlements attempted more sophisticated waste management. The Coppergate excavations in York revealed evidence of organized waste collection systems, where human excrement was gathered and used as fertilizer for crops. But this practice created new contamination pathways, as parasites and pathogens moved from human waste to food crops and back to human consumers. The health consequences were catastrophic. Chronic diarrhea, intestinal bleeding, malnutrition from parasitic damage, and constant reinfection created a population in perpetual poor health. Child mortality rates soared due to parasitic infections. Adults suffered from chronic pain, fatigue, and digestive problems that significantly reduced their quality of life and life expectancy. Archaeological analysis of Viking skeletons reveals the physical evidence of these conditions. Bone damage from nutritional deficiencies, dental problems from poor digestion, and signs of chronic infections are common findings. Many skeletons show evidence of multiple parasitic infections simultaneously. The Vikings developed various strategies to manage their toilet-related health problems, but these were largely ineffective. Herbal remedies, dietary restrictions, and ritual purification couldn't address the fundamental problem. Their waste management systems were creating and perpetuating disease cycles that infected entire communities. Some settlements experimented with communal latrines located further from living areas, but these created new problems. Walking long distances to reach toilets, especially during harsh weather, led many Vikings to improvise with chamber pots or simply defecate near their homes. The scattered waste created multiple contamination sites rather than containing the problem. The psychological impact of chronic digestive problems cannot be understated. Constant abdominal pain, unpredictable bowel movements, and the social embarrassment of parasitic infections affected every aspect of Viking life. Yet they had no understanding of germ theory, no concept of bacterial contamination, no knowledge of proper sanitation practices. They lived in a world where disease seemed random, where invisible forces caused suffering that no amount of courage or strength could prevent. Their response was often to seek spiritual rather than practical solutions, offering sacrifices to gods they hoped might provide relief from mysterious ailments. But perhaps most shocking of all is how these toilet-related health problems created genetic mutations that continue to affect Scandinavian populations today. The constant parasitic infections forced Viking immune systems to evolve rapidly, developing genetic variations that provided protection against worm-related diseases. These mutations were life-saving adaptations for people living with chronic parasitic infections. But in our modern, parasite-free world, these same genetic variations have become risk factors for lung disease, emphysema, and other potentially fatal conditions. The silver comb was a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship, carved from a single piece of deer antler, decorated with intricate runic inscriptions, housed in a leather case lined with silk fabric. The Viking who owned it spent more on this grooming tool than most people earned in a year. The same Viking lived in a house where cattle urinated on the floor, where the air was thick with smoke and the stench of decomposing organic matter, where intestinal worms writhed in his belly while he carefully arranged his hair. This is the central paradox of Viking hygiene, a civilization obsessed with personal appearance, yet living in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. They spent hours perfecting their grooming while sharing spit-contaminated water bowls. They owned multiple changes of clean clothing while sleeping in beds crawling with lice and fleas. How do we reconcile these contradictions? The answer lies in understanding that Viking concepts of cleanliness were radically different from our own. They distinguished between visible dirt and invisible contamination in ways that seem almost schizophrenic to modern sensibilities. External appearance mattered tremendously. A Viking's hair, clothing, jewelry, and grooming tools were public statements of wealth, status, and cultural sophistication. These visible markers could mean the difference between success and failure in trade negotiations, marriage arrangements, or social alliances. But internal contamination, parasites, bacteria, diseases that couldn't be seen, belonged to a different category entirely. These were matters of fate, divine will, or spiritual significance, rather than personal responsibility. A Viking might spend an hour arranging his beard while harboring tapeworms that were slowly destroying his liver. The weekly bathing ritual demonstrates this perfectly. Vikings would immerse themselves completely in hot water, scrub their skin until it was pink and clean, wash and condition their hair with expensive imported oils, then immediately return to longhouses where they shared intimate quarters with livestock and their associated parasites. Their clothing practices reveal similar contradictions. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings owned and maintained extensive wardrobes, silk from Constantinople, wool dyed with expensive pigments from across Europe, linen undergarments changed regularly. Yet these same garments were stored in chests, alongside furs and hides that harbored fleas, mites, and other parasites. Viking women spent enormous amounts of time and resources on cosmetics and personal adornment. They used imported coal to line their eyes, crushed berries for lip color, oils and perfumes to scent their skin. Simultaneously, they lived in houses where human and animal waste accumulated throughout the winter months. The Vikings' approach to dental hygiene exemplifies these contradictions most clearly. They would endure agonizing tooth filing procedures, creating decorative grooves that were carefully painted with colored resins. Yet they had no understanding of basic dental care. They didn't clean their teeth regularly, had no concept of cavity prevention, and often suffered from severe dental problems that caused constant pain and infections. Archaeological examination of Viking skulls reveals advanced tooth decay, abscesses, and bone loss from gum disease. Many Vikings lost most of their teeth by middle age, yet they continued to invest time and suffering in cosmetic tooth modifications that served no functional purpose and often made dental problems worse. Their attitude toward food safety was equally contradictory. Vikings were sophisticated traders who understood the value of preserved foods, proper storage techniques, and quality control for trade goods. They developed advanced methods for smoking fish, curing meat, and fermenting dairy products that could remain edible for months or years. Yet they regularly consumed raw or undercooked meat from animals they knew to be diseased. They drank from water sources they had contaminated with their own waste. They stored food in containers that harbored parasites and bacteria from previous contents. Part of this contradiction stemmed from their religious beliefs. Vikings viewed certain aspects of bodily existence as sacred or spiritually significant. Sharing bodily fluids created bonds between warriors. Consuming raw meat connected them to the divine essence of animals. Tolerating parasites demonstrated acceptance of natural cycles beyond human control. Their gods reflected these attitudes. Odin was both wise and wild, sophisticated and savage. Thor was mighty, but also crude and excessive. The Norse pantheon celebrated contradictions rather than resolving them. Divine figures could be simultaneously beautiful and monstrous, clean and filthy, civilized and barbaric. Viking poetry and sagas reveal similar contradictory attitudes toward hygiene and health. Heroes are praised for their beautiful hair and impressive clothing, yet they're also celebrated for enduring horrible wounds, diseases, and physical hardships without complaint. Cleanliness was admired, but so was the ability to function effectively while dirty, sick, or injured. The social structure of Viking society reinforced these contradictions. Wealthy Vikings invested heavily in visible markers of cleanliness and sophistication because these demonstrated their ability to trade with distant cultures, purchase expensive goods, and maintain high standards despite harsh living conditions. But they also needed to prove their hardiness, their ability to survive in conditions that would defeat softer, more civilized peoples. Excessive concern with invisible contamination or minor discomforts was seen as weakness, unsuitable for warriors who might spend months at sea or years in foreign territories. Women's roles created additional contradictory pressures. They were expected to maintain beautiful appearances, manage household cleanliness, and preserve family health. Yet they were also responsible for managing livestock, processing raw materials that carried diseases, and maintaining homes that were necessarily contaminated due to practical survival requirements. The result was a culture that achieved remarkable sophistication in some areas while remaining shockingly primitive in others. Vikings could navigate across oceans using sophisticated astronomical knowledge, yet they couldn't prevent basic waterborne diseases. They could create intricate works of art from precious metals, yet they couldn't develop effective waste disposal systems. These contradictions weren't signs of ignorance or backwardness. They represented a coherent worldview that prioritized different values than our own. Vikings understood that life involved trade-offs, that survival sometimes required accepting conditions that were less than ideal, that perfection in one area might mean accepting imperfection in others. Their approach to personal hygiene reflected these broader philosophical attitudes. They achieved cleanliness where it mattered most to them in appearance, social signaling, and ritual contexts, while accepting contamination in areas they considered less important or beyond human control. But the ultimate irony of Viking hygiene practices is how their adaptive strategies continue to affect their descendants today. The genetic legacy of Viking hygiene practices reads like a medical thriller with a twist ending that spans 1,000 years. In February 2016, researchers at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine published findings that would revolutionize our understanding of how the Vikings' disgusting living conditions continue to kill their descendants today. The study revealed that chronic parasitic infections forced rapid evolutionary changes in Viking immune systems, changes that saved lives then but cause lung disease now. Alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency affects nearly 5% of people in Scandinavia, making it one of the most common genetic disorders in the region. This condition leaves people vulnerable to emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and liver damage. For decades, scientists couldn't understand why such a harmful mutation remained so prevalent in the gene pool. The answer was hidden in those revolting Viking latrines. The constant presence of intestinal worms forced Viking immune systems to produce modified versions of ALPHA, 1 antitrypsins, that were specifically designed to combat parasitic enzymes. These genetic variants provided crucial protection against the liver flukes, roundworms, and whipworms that infested every Viking settlement. Vikings with these mutations survived. Vikings without them died from parasitic damage to their vital organs. Over generations, the protective variants became dominant in Scandinavian populations. But here's the cruel irony. These life-saving adaptations only worked in environments saturated with parasites. In our modern, sanitized world, the same genetic variants that once protected Vikings from worm infections now leave their descendants defenseless against their own immune systems. The modified alpha-1 antitrypsin can't properly protect lung tissue from inflammatory damage caused by smoking, air pollution, or respiratory infections. What saved Viking warriors from dying of liver fluke infestations now causes their great-great-grandchildren to develop emphysema in their 50s. This genetic time bomb affects millions of people across Northern Europe, North America, and anywhere Viking descendants settled. Modern Scandinavians, Icelanders, and people of Norse heritage in Britain, Ireland, and North America carry these mutations at rates far higher than other populations. The medical implications are staggering. Emphysema rates in Scandinavia are among the highest in the world, even accounting for smoking and environmental factors. Liver disease, chronic respiratory problems, and immune system disorders all trace back to genetic adaptations that were essential for survival in parasite-infested Viking settlements. But the Vikings' hygiene legacy extends far beyond genetics. Their approach to cleanliness, the careful attention to visible appearance, combined with tolerance for invisible contamination, established patterns that persisted in Northern European culture for centuries. The emphasis on external grooming, the social significance of bathing rituals, the connection between cleanliness and social status, all have roots in Viking practices. Even their contradictions became cultural inheritance. The Scandinavian concept of lagom, the idea that balance and moderation are more important than perfection, reflects the Viking understanding that life requires trade-offs, that survival sometimes means accepting less than ideal conditions. Their innovative approaches to personal grooming influenced medieval European fashion and hygiene practices. The elaborate combs, grooming tools, and cosmetic preparations that archaeologists find in Viking sites were prototypes for similar items that spread throughout Europe during the Middle Ages. The weekly bathing ritual that caused such jealousy among the English eventually became standard practice across Northern Europe. The Vikings' lagerdæger evolved into the modern weekend, when people traditionally have time for personal care and household cleaning. Their sophisticated understanding of soap making, textile care, and personal adornment contributed to the development of medieval industries that would later become the foundation of modern cosmetics, fashion, and personal care sectors. But perhaps most importantly, the Vikings demonstrated that hygiene is always cultural, never absolute. What seems disgusting to one society may be normal or even sacred to another. Their practices weren't primitive or backward. They were sophisticated responses to specific environmental and social challenges. The Arabs who criticized Viking bathroom habits came from desert cultures where water was precious and ritual purity required careful conservation of clean water. The English, who resented Viking grooming practices, lived in a society where frequent bathing was considered medically dangerous. The Vikings developed hygiene practices that made sense for their specific circumstances: harsh climates, limited resources, close-knit warrior societies, and economic systems based on trade and mobility. Their solutions weren't perfect, but they were remarkably well adapted to the challenges they faced. Modern hygiene practices would have been impossible for Vikings to implement. They lacked the infrastructure, technology, and scientific knowledge that makes contemporary cleanliness possible. Yet, they created systems that allowed them to maintain social cohesion, cultural identity, and economic success across centuries of expansion and cultural change. Their story reminds us that our own hygiene practices aren't natural or inevitable. They're cultural choices based on our current understanding of health, our available technology, and our social values. Future generations may look back at our practices with the same mixture of fascination and horror that we feel when examining Viking latrines. The water we consider pure enough to drink might seem contaminated to people with more advanced filtration technology. The chemicals we use in our soaps and cosmetics might appear as primitive and toxic as Viking eye makeup. The amount of water we waste on daily showers might seem as excessive as Viking weekly baths seemed to their contemporaries. What endures from the Viking experience is the understanding that human societies will always find ways to balance competing demands: appearance versus health, individual needs versus group survival, innovation versus tradition, cleanliness versus practicality. The Vikings achieved remarkable things despite, or perhaps because of, their revolting hygiene practices. They explored new continents, established trade networks that spanned 3 continents, created artistic and literary works that still influence us today, and developed social systems that provided stability and prosperity for centuries. Their legacy isn't diminished by the knowledge that they shared spit-contaminated water bowls or lived with livestock in smoky J houses. If anything, these details make their achievements more impressive. They built a sophisticated civilization while dealing with health challenges that would cripple modern societies. The genetic mutations that protected them from parasitic diseases continue to affect their descendants, creating new medical challenges that require modern solutions. But those same mutations represent successful adaptations that allowed Viking culture to survive and thrive in conditions that might have destroyed other societies. In the end, the disgusting hygiene habits of the Vikings tell us as much about human adaptability as they do about medieval filth. They remind us that survival sometimes requires accepting conditions that seem intolerable, that cultural success isn't always based on what we consider proper or clean, and that even our most revolting practices may serve purposes we don't immediately understand. The Vikings were neither the savage barbarians of popular imagination nor the pristine warriors of romantic fantasy. They were complex people dealing with harsh realities in ways that made sense within their cultural context. Their hygiene practices were disgusting by our standards, but effective by theirs. Their story continues in the DNA of their descendants, in the cultural practices that evolved from their innovations, and in the ongoing human struggle to balance competing demands for health, appearance, survival, and social connection. The next time you turn on a tap and expect clean water to flow, or take a hot shower without thinking about the infrastructure that makes it possible, or use antibiotics to cure an infection that would have killed a medieval person, remember the Vikings. Remember that our cleanliness is built on technologies and knowledge that weren't available to them, and that future generations may look back at our practices with similar mixtures of understanding and revulsion. The Vikings did the best they could with what they had. Their disgusting hygiene habits were responses to real challenges, successful adaptations to difficult circumstances, and innovations that contributed to one of history's most dynamic and influential cultures. And in the genetic legacy they passed down to millions of their descendants, their struggles with parasites and disease continue to shape human health in ways we're only beginning to understand. The story of Viking hygiene isn't just history, it's biology, genetics, and medicine rolled into one complex narrative that connects the medieval past to the modern present. Their revolting practices saved lives then and continue to affect lives now. It's a legacy as complex and contradictory as the Vikings themselves, disgusting and fascinating, primitive and sophisticated, deadly and life-saving all at once. That's the true Viking way, embracing contradictions, surviving impossible conditions, and leaving marks on the world that persist long after the last longship has returned to harbor.